Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my February wrap up. So the month of February was actually quite successful for me in amounts of books that I read. I read 11 books in total, which is definitely a lot. However, I will say that a lot of them were very short. I had quite a few books that were around 200 pages this month, and I do feel like that was reflected in my ratings because we also had a lot of 3 stars, and if you guys know me, then you'll know that short books are generally not my favorite. That being said, one of the short books that I read this month was also a 5-star. So getting into the stats for this month, I read 3,724 pages in total, which is actually above my average. My average is like 3,500, 3,600, and it doesn't seem like it's that much more, but there were only 28 days in February and my average pages per day came out at 133, which is spookily exactly the same as January. For the star ratings, it was a very mediocre month. We had 5 3-star reads, 4 3-star reads, and 2 5 stars. This breaks down to an average of 3.72 stars per book and is a little bit lower than last month's average. For the demographics, we had 1 young adult, 1 new adult, and 9 adult books. For the formats, we had 7 standardly formatted novels and 4 ebooks. For the genres, this is really interesting and something that I did not notice happening. I read 7 fantasy romance books, only 2 normal fantasy, 1 science fiction, and 1 romance. And for the places where I sourced these books from, 4 of them were books that I'd hauled in 2021, 3 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2021, 3 of them I read on Kindle Unlimited, and 1 of them I received from the publisher. Something that isn't represented in these stats as well, which I may as well just get out of the way here, is that I did have a DNF in February. This is my first DNF in, I want to say, over a year. I actually don't remember what the last book I DNF'd is, but that was Secrets of the Star-Crossed, the first book in the Once and Future Queen series by Clara O'Connor. This is an art copy that was sent to me for review, so I am really sad that I DNF'd it. I do usually persevere if I'm reading a book that I'm not enjoying, so that I can give you guys like a conclusive review on what exactly it was that I didn't enjoy about it. However, I got 172 pages into this one and I just could not continue any longer. So this one is a young adult fantasy, and the synopsis of this pretty much just says some of the elements that are involved. So going into this, all I knew is that it was a blend of the Roman Empire, Arthurian legend, and Celtic folklore. And when I received this, when I wanted to read it, I did keep saying that I was excited to see how they were all going to come together, because that is quite a few elements in there. And then when I started reading it, I realized that they are not the only elements in here, and it was just truly too much to try and fit into one book. Aside from all of those things, this is actually a sci-fi. It is set in a futuristic version of Britain with an alternate history. So the main character lives in this walled city, which is obviously from the Roman Empire days. Outside of the walls, there are people who follow the laws of, I guess, like more the Celtic folklore elements. At 172 pages in, I still don't understand where the Arthurian legend retelling comes into this one, and there was just a lot of very brief, very quick mentions of British history in here that were very confusing. The Tudor monarchy was mentioned at one point, also Princess Margaret was mentioned at one point, and it was very quick, almost like name dropping. So in a paragraph you'd have like an info dump of like a period of history, and it'd say like the Tudor monarchy were fighting with these people and Princess Margaret did this thing, and it was just all very quick, and I was struggling to place how all of these things were actually relevant to the story. It kind of felt like you needed a degree in British history to understand this book, and even then you wouldn't have been able to, because it's an alternate history. So even though the groups of people like the Tudor monarchy is the same, it did exist, what happened while the Tudors were reigning is different from what happens in this book, because it is an alternate history. There's also mentions of the Britons, the Saxons, the Danes, and it was just all a lot, and I couldn't figure out how it was piecing together. This is also heavily focused on romance. It reads like a historical romance, with the main character meeting this boy in history class, although thinking about it after I did my vlog for this, I don't understand why she was in class. It's something called citizenship class, because the main character is actually 21, so I also don't understand why this book is young adult. But she meets this boy in class and she's promised to another, because they have this like futuristic sci-fi matching service, but she's she's very drawn to this boy, and the narrative of the book just follows this guy. Like, she takes something to save him from being arrested and refuses to give it back to him, and then it's just all about those two. There's a point in the bit that I read where she helps somebody out, but she comes from a place of extreme privilege, and when she was helping this person, it just felt like I'm doing this because it makes me feel good to help other people kind of thing, in a really like snooty, pretentious kind of way. And the way the romance was written as well, it reminded me a lot of the dialogue in old Hitchcock movies, which it was all just a really weird blend. I wasn't having a good time. I did try to listen to the audiobook of this as well to help me through it, to help me focus, and I still couldn't make it past page 172. The thing that made me finally put this down is that the main character started repeatedly cursing Hades. So she would say something like, curse you to the pits of Hades. There was a couple of like different variations of that through the last few chapters I read, and like Hades is a Greek god and she is in a Roman city. Why would there be Greek gods there? Especially because the society is built on a code. Magic isn't allowed, so all of the Celtic stuff is not allowed. You're supposed to follow the strict Roman code and the rules of this society. So why are you cursing to Hades? It didn't make sense. I'm sad that I had to DNF it. I would have liked to finish it to give you guys like a full picture of this book, but I just couldn't read any more past that 172 page point. The next four are the first 4 books that I read in the month, and I'm going to run through them pretty quickly because I read them for a themed reading vlog. Jade from JD Ray Reads was hosting Polathon at the beginning of the month, so I decided to put a twist on it and I read 4 polar bear shapeshifter fantasy romances. It was a wild ride, but I did have similar thoughts about all 4 books. None of them were particularly memorable. I gave all of them 3 stars, although I will say there was a different thing that I liked and disliked about each and every one. I don't really feel like I need to go into a whole ton of detail with them because all of them were under 200 pages, so there isn't a whole lot to cover anyway, and I did make like a 50-minute vlog about polar bear romances. So the first one I read was Bear Ever Yours. This one was about a woman who won a holiday to this fancy resort and she didn't remember entering the competition, and she starts to take scuba lessons with this guy who turns out to be a polar bear shifter. Gave that one 3 stars. I felt like the conflict in the plot didn't really need to be there. It was kind of fast, kind of rushed, and it was also a little bit ridiculous. It was like 2 stars quality wise, but I found it really funny because some of the things happening in that were just absolutely wild. I then read Polar Enemies. This was more up my alley in terms of it had more of a high fantasy feel to it, although it was still contemporary fantasy, and this is about the leader of a polar bear shapeshifting pack who are trying to find refuge in this Winter Queen's kingdom. And in the history of this, the leader of the shifter pack had actually killed the Winter Queen. However, he was also in love with her, and during the story he finds out that she actually is still alive. I did really enjoy this. I think I would have really liked it if it would have been longer. However, there was a plot twist in there that I really didn't appreciate, and I found it to be quite unnecessary and in poor taste. Next up we had Polar Bond. I enjoyed the steam level of this one. This one was a contemporary fantasy about a woman who is going to her best friend's wedding and she becomes interested in the best man. However, there is a panther shapeshifter who believes that the love interest should be hers, so there's a little bit of conflict there. There were a couple of elements of this that I was like, why is this happening? Yeah, it was fine, 3 stars. And then the last of those was actually my favorite, which was Alpha Bear's Fated Mate, and from the cover and title of this I really did not think I was gonna like it, but this one has a bit of a backstory as well, stuff that happened before the start of the book, and our main character has moved to the Alaskan wilderness. She had a fling with this guy that ended with her nearly dying, and she was taken away for her own protection, hasn't seen him again, and he is part of a polar bear shapeshifter clan, and they are having to move because through evolution their color is starting to change. They can no longer live in Antarctica because with the polar ice caps melting they're starting to change colors, so they're looking for somewhere where they can camouflage themselves better, and they end up in the Alaskan wilderness. I think that the backstory that happened before the book was more believable in this one and set it up for a more organic story that I did thoroughly enjoy. There was also like multiple elements to this as well. We had stuff about environmentalism and conservation and things like that, and I just found the whole thing to be more believable, and I really enjoyed the writing in this one as well. So moving on to the rest of the books that I read in the month, the first one was A Promise of Fire by Amanda Boucher. This is the first book in the Kingmaker Chronicles, and I read this one because I was hosting a few events for Faro Feb, which was a fantasy romance event that lasted the whole month of February, and I interviewed Amanda Boucher on the 7th. So I wanted to read at least one of her books, and I'm so glad that I did because I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm really excited to read the rest of the series and also her other more like sci-fi fantasy series. So this one follows a young woman called Kat who is a soothsayer in the circus. This land is split between the magic-filled icy north and the human-filled lands of the south, which are typically governed by warlords. Kat is a soothsayer because she has run away from the north for reasons that we don't know at the beginning of this, and she's hiding out in the circus essentially. Our love interest is Griffin, and his family have just taken over one of the southern kingdoms. However, it's unheard of for hoi polloi, which are non-magic users, to control an area. It's normally magic wielders that are the royalty and the rulers of this world. So he is looking for somebody with strong magical talents to help secure his family's hold on this kingdom, and he finds Kat, who is actually the kingmaker. She can tell when people are lying and when they are telling the truth, and because of that she is extremely valuable because she can make kingdoms rise and fall essentially. If she can tell who's lying and who's telling the truth, then she can help to build a very strong kingdom. So Griffin kidnaps her. There is a simmering attraction between the both of them. However, the fact that he kidnapped her pretty much puts a spanner in the works. So I thoroughly enjoyed this. This is also inspired by ancient Greece, so we have like Poseidon and Hades in here, and while it is inspired by ancient Greece, it is not a historical fantasy, it is a high fantasy. So the world has taken inspiration from ancient Greek gods with the gods present, as opposed to being like a more realistic ancient Greek kind of setting. But I really enjoyed learning how the magic system worked in relation to these gods and how they were actually relevant to the story and how the Greek influence was relevant to the story. I also really liked the sexual tension in here and the attraction between the two main characters. Griffin can be heated, he can have a little bit of a temper, but overall he is quite stoic, and Kat is like very feisty and dynamic. She does remind me a little bit of Spencer from Skyward in that she retaliates quite easily, and she's also like a little bit confrontational and aggressive. So she would just be flying off the handle every 10 seconds, and Griffin would just be in complete exasperation and not really know what to do with her. And this book is incredibly funny as well, which I really did not expect going into it, but I really did appreciate. I laughed out loud in multiple places, and it has like a couple of different types of humor. Some like ridiculous stuff in here. There's the parallel between Griffin and Kat and how that creates humor, and there's also quite a bit of sarcasm as well. And I know that people say that sarcasm is the lowest form of wit, but it's also my favorite type of humor, so I definitely appreciated the inclusion of that. I gave this one 4 stars. There were a couple of things that I didn't love about it. One is that I just wasn't as invested as I usually am in a 5-star. The second thing is that Griffin can be a bit intense. They've had this attraction this entire time, and then we have like a few moments between them, you know, and he will just switch really quickly to like, you are mine, never leave me, and it's just a little bit intense. He is like quite a dominant male, like alpha male presence in this book, and just the way that I seem to shift quickly in a couple of places really threw me off. But I did really love this book. I already have book 2 ready to read. I'm so excited. I didn't fit it into my March TBR and I'm really sad about it, but I am hoping that I can continue this sometime soon, because I know that Amanda Boucher is actually writing a spin-off series to this, as Griffin has a warband, and the dynamic within the warband is kind of like Rhys and Azriel Cassian, or like the Cadre and Sarah J Maas books, and I think that the spin-off is going to follow one of the members of Griffin's warband, so I'm really excited about that because they were my favorite characters throughout this. I then read Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb, which was one of my disappointments of the month, but it wasn't too disappointing. But this is the 3rd book in the Live Ship Traders, and as a lot of you guys know, my book club, Catch Up Book Club, is doing a read along of Robin Hobb's Realm Realm of the Elderlings, which is an epic 16-book series that is broken down into smaller series. So the live ship trader starts off in a little trading town called Bingtown, where the Vestrit family are from. Bingtown is known for its live ships. These are massive vessels that are made out of wizard wood, and when 3 generations of a family die on the decks, the ship comes to life. So the Vestrits own one of these live ships, and it is about to come to life when the patriarch of the family, Ephron, dies. Now, one of the daughters, Althea, believes that her father is sick. She's been away at sea. However, she comes home, finds out that her father is actually dying, and she has always believed that she is going to inherit the ship. However, as Ephron is dying, he gives the ship to Althea's sister and her brother-in-law. So a lot of the plot of this series is Althea trying to get her ship back, but it is definitely more complex than that. One of the other main characters is Althea's nephew, who has been forced to work on the ship. He went away to a monastery. However, he has been called back to the family, seemingly for his grandfather's funeral. However, while he is there, his father makes him sail with him, says he's going to make a man out of him, and forces Wintro to sail on Vivacia. We also have the Rainwilds, which is one of the more magical areas of the Realm of the Elderlings, and a lot of information about them, which I won't say much because they're not super present through the beginning of this series, but they do play a big part in it. That was one of my favorite parts of this series because it's not something that we hear about really at all in the Fitz books. And we also have a pirate plot going on because there is a pirate called Kenneth who would like to be the king of the pirates, and the rest of the pirates just think it's stupid, like you can't have a king of pirates because pirates answer to no man. And Kenneth decides that he would like to acquire a live ship for himself to help him achieve his goals. So I gave this one 4 stars. It was disappointing only because I've given the rest of the books that I've read so far from Robin Hobb 5 stars. I've truly loved them. This one, however, just did not quite live up to the rest of the ones that I've already read. I do actually prefer the Live Ship Traders to the Farseer trilogy. I prefer the storytelling in this, which is multi-perspective as opposed to being solely in one character's head as we are in the Farseer trilogy, and the characters in here are some of my favorites that I've read so far. I love Althea and Brashen. I love Amber. I really like Rain as well, and the character development of some of the characters, especially Malta and Wintro in this series, is top tier. However, I just did not feel like we had as much growth and progression throughout this book. This is a 900-page book, so we do have quite a lot of content here, but a lot of the perspectives felt really skippy. So throughout the end of the second book in this series, there are certain characters and places that we don't see as frequently. So at the beginning of this book, the chapters that were in those characters' perspectives or in those settings felt really jumpy and info dumpy, as we just gave like a stream of information about what had happened during the end of the last book. I also felt like the pacing was really jumpy between perspectives. Now, as this is the conclusion of a trilogy, quite a lot has to happen to bring everything together ready for the epic conclusion of the series, but I felt like we were spending too much time away from perspectives. So in certain perspectives, I would notice that a lot had happened, or they were in a much different place than they were the last time we left them, and I just felt that it was very quick. And that is of course relative because this is a really big book, but Robin Hobb's books are really slow, really detailed, really atmospheric. So having such noticeable jumps between perspectives is something that I noticed, and I wouldn't have minded it being longer, or I wouldn't have minded a 4th book in this series if that would have meant that it was more in keeping with everything I've read from Robin Hobb before and felt more true to the nature of the Realm of the Elderlings. There was one plot element in here that I really didn't like. I'm obviously not going to say what it is because of spoilers, but it does happen not only late in the book but really late in the series, and it was essentially a female character having to suffer to further the plot line of a male character. Now, I understand in context to the plot line that was furthered, I understand why it happened, and that whole like character arc and what was being illustrated there I really enjoyed. I just really wish it didn't have to come at the expense of one of of the female main characters in here, especially because then that character also had to deal with the repercussions of that event, and it just didn't serve any other purpose really than to further that male plotline. So I just really wish that hadn't have happened. However, what I will say is that Robin Hobb's books do contain a lot of representation for mental health. We have PTSD rep in here, lots of like trauma and recovery plot lines, also lots of just like general depression representation, which has been represented in this series from the beginning, and there are quite a few themes of sexual assault throughout these last two books. And while some of these instances I don't feel like were dealt with in the best way, this one was published in the year 2000. That's 21 years ago, and for the time period I do feel like it is very possible that these books were doing more good than harm by actually representing these kind of things when fiction was really just beginning to start to deal with these topics. So 4 stars, not my favorite in the series, my lowest rated Robin Hobb book so far, but I do really love The Realm of the Eldlings and I'm excited to get stuck into the Tawny Man trilogy next month. Next up we have the 5 stars. We only had 2. One of them was very on brand for me and the other one was completely unexpected, and the unexpected one was Desperate Measures by Katie Roberts. So this is the first book in the Wicked Villain series, and it is kind of a Disney retelling almost, or a heavily inspired by Disney adult romance erotica series. So the main theme with this series is that the hero or heroine of the Disney movie falls in love with the villain. This first installment follows Jasmine and Jafar. They are all contemporary stories set in this fictional city called Carver City. So in this one, instead of being a princess, Jasmine is the daughter of this very influential, I guess they're kind of like mob bosses, and she has no value to her father aside from who she's going to be married to and essentially sold off to. So her father has agreed for her to be married to Ali, who is Aladdin, until Jafar kills her father, takes over her territory, and in doing so also claims Jasmine. So I believe that all of the books in this series are BDSM themed, so if that is something you're not into, would definitely steer clear of this series. But this is also like a consensual non-consent romance as well. So there are like non-consent role plays, there are safe words and everything, as is typical with BDSM, but it is that kind of vibe. So if that isn't something you're into, I really do not think that this would be for you, but I absolutely loved this. I was a little bit hesitant going into it because I knew that it was very erotic, like very steamy, and I think the last book I went into knowing it was going to be pretty much erotica was when I read 50 Shades of Grey when I was 18, and I did not have a good experience with those books, so I didn't know what I would expect going into this. Disney is also something that is very close to my heart. It's my childhood, as it is for everyone. It's extremely nostalgic. I really love what Katie Roberts did with this series. I think her writing and her storytelling and the chemistry between the characters and the way that she writes the sex scenes in here is absolutely fantastic. Now, at the beginning of this video, I said it is not common for me to like short books, and when I did the polar bear reading vlog, I did say that the biggest conclusion I'd drawn from that was that I just shouldn't be reading short fiction because typically I don't enjoy it. And something that was common throughout the majority of those polar bear books is that I just felt like the plot was rushed or insubstantial, and there just wasn't enough there, like plot wise. It didn't feel well balanced. This, I feel, is the perfect balance between the plot and the romance. It is only 207 pages. There is not a great deal of content here, but the plot made sense from start to finish. The plot was there like from the beginning, and there was like character growth, character development. There was a progression of character and plot, as well as these really steamy erotic scenes and a compelling romance. So when I went into this, I was going into it for the romance. I expected to at least like those elements, and what I did not expect was a really well thought out, well constructed plot. So I don't have too much to say about this one because it is just like a BDSM romance, but there is a plot in there if you have been looking to try out some erotic fiction, try and read some more steamier romances, but you've had bad experiences in the past or you don't really know where to start. Would recommend picking up Desperate Measures. My next 5-star will come as a surprise to no one. one. That one is A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J Maas, my most anticipated release of the year. I believe that we have had confirmation now that Crescent City 2 is not going to be released this year, but it is going to be released within the year, I believe. So by this time next March, we should have the sequel to Crescent City, which means that this is in fact my #1 top anticipated release of the year. I can't really tell you too much about this without spoiling the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. So the couple of things that I can tell you, I guess, while keeping it vague, is that this follows Nesta Archeron, who is the main character of the ACOTAR trilogy sister, and the events of the ACOTAR trilogy were traumatic for a lot of the characters, but especially Feyre's two sisters, and the way they both reacted is very different. But the way that Nesta deals with her trauma and grief and processes it is by pushing everyone away and generally being horrible. She has not been the nicest character right from the very first page of ACOTAR, but all of this has kind of just made everything worse for her, and we've gotten to a point where she's awful to everybody. Nobody can stand being around her, so she has been banished from the city, and Cassian has been sent there to help her out. She has a very strict schedule where she has to train in the morning and work in the afternoon, and essentially the goal of this is just for her to get her shit together and stop being such a nightmare. So when this book was announced, I thought that this was going to be the first book in a series that follows Nesta. However, I did attend one of the virtual events for the release of this book, and it is actually a standalone. The rest of the books in the ACOTAR series are going to be romance standalones with an overarching fantasy plot, which definitely makes sense once you have read this, and I'm really intrigued to see where that is going to go. So instead of it being a separate series, as I thought, it is actually book 4 in the ACOTAR series, and it is also the first book in the series that has been published as adult. Like, they all should have been published as adult to start off with, but this one is the first official one to be published within the adult demographic. And with that, we have a whole ton of very steamy, very explicit scenes, lots of swearing. I would say that plot wise it's still the same as ACOTAR, like there's still the same kind of themes and stuff, and I would also say that the plot going forward past the original trilogy is actually less complex than the original plotline that we had. And essentially this being placed in adult just means that the sex scenes are more explicit and stuff like that. I loved the romance in here and like all of that progression throughout this, but Cassian is one of my favorite characters. I absolutely adore Cassian. I have also really liked Nesta. There are a few of her actions that left me confused towards the latter end of the series and in the novella, but overall I have, if not liked her, at least admired her agency and her audacity and how she will just like literally be the worst and give absolutely no fucks. I always respect a character who was like that. But the best thing about this book is that it is a emotional journey. The focus of this book is on trauma, grief, suffering, female trauma especially, like the trauma that women often suffer at the hands of men, and it is about finding peace and healing and coming to terms with what has happened to you, kind of accepting it as something that has happened and then eventually moving past it. So we have this really just like great emotional journey for Nesta in that regard, and this book really fucked with me because I identify with Nesta a little bit too much. The way she processes the things that have happened to her and the way that manifests is something that I deeply identify with. One of the things that she keeps coming back to, one of the things that happened to her that is constantly like recurring, is something that I can relate to, even though the circumstances are completely different, even though the feelings behind the event are different. I understand why she keeps coming back to this one moment, why she keeps dwelling on it. So my mental health was up and down throughout the entirety of this book, but for that emotional character journey, this book truly does mean a lot to me. And we also had really strong themes of female friendship in here as well, which I truly appreciated. The new characters that were introduced in here, Emery and Gwen, I absolutely love, and I love that female friendship group dynamic that was brought through in this one as well. So that being said, this is not one of my favorite Sarah J Maas books, and it had a lot of the things that I really loved in it. Like, the characters in this series are some of my favorite characters of all time, and I've read so many books and reread them as well, spent so much time with them. I have fan art and everything. You guys know I'm massive Maas trash. I loved this book for that, and I will always love this series because it's just so comforting to read. But I will say that this series is also incredibly safe now. I don't think that anything drastic is going to happen to any of the characters in this series going forward. There's a comfort that comes with that, reading these books and kind of knowing deep down that everything's going to be okay. But the reason why Sarah J Maas is my favorite author is because she has this epic fantasy. She has strong themes of found family and friendship. She creates a cast of characters that I feel like I know because of how much like development and time is spent with them. But she also has a really epic, complex plot with some like dire situations and really high stakes. So with that missing, with the high stakes element especially missing, with the knowledge that I feel that everything's going to be all right, it can't really be one of my favorite Sarah J Maas books. I do have a full spoiler video on this if you guys have read this and want my full thoughts and want me to go a little bit more in depth about why I feel a certain way about certain things, then I will link that for you guys. But yeah, overall solidly Sarah J Maas, 5 stars. Love the character development, absolutely adore the characters and the setting of this book. Loved being back in this world again, but I just don't feel like the stakes are high in this series anymore, and that is going to impact where these books rank in my favorites list because I'm missing that like typical fantasy stuff that I'm expecting. I then read one of probably my most disappointing book of the month actually, and that was Starsight by Brandon Sanderson. This was on my 5 stars prediction list. I've been reading a lot of Brandon Sanderson, as you guys know, and there is more Brandon Sanderson to come in this video, but this is the sequel to Skyward. It's one of his young adult sci-fi series, and in this one we are following a young girl called Spencer who lives on this planet where the humans have been living underground and they've been trying to break through and build on the surface. However, every time they try and do that and try and progress, they are attacked by this alien race called the Krell. Now the humans have started to fight back, and Spencer's father fought in a pivotal battle between the humans and the Krell, and he deserted. So Spencer and her family have been branded a coward. Her family can't even have like real jobs because of this. She's treated terribly because of her father's actions, but Spencer wants nothing more than to become a fighter pilot, and the people in authority are making it very difficult for her to do so. So I had my issues with Skyward. My favorite thing about this series I would say is Spencer's character development, because she was just the most irritating character at the beginning of Skyward, and by the time we got to the end I teared up in multiple points. I really loved the themes of like found family and how everything like came together and felt really emotional, and I really loved Spencer by the end of Skyward. Gave that book 4 stars. Going into this I'd already struggled through the beginning of Skyward, so I thought it was onwards and upwards from here, and this book could possibly be 5 stars. However, I just did not like the turn that this book took. Straight from the off, pretty much, the book is expanding in this installment, and it just felt like a repeat of the first book, because I feel like the overall theme of Skyward is that Spencer enters an environment where she feels a certain way about things and people, and throughout the course of the book she changes her opinions. And in this book she enters a new environment and the same thing happens, you know, like she has a certain way of thinking, way of feeling about this whole situation, which gradually begins to change. So I just felt like I'd really read this book before, and there are a lot of new characters introduced in this one. The old characters are still present, but we have a new cast of characters, and I just did not enjoy them as much as I enjoyed the original ones, and I actively missed the characters from the first book while I was reading this. I gave this one 3 stars, and that is purely for the characters of Spencer and Embot, because the plot in here was okay, but I found a lot of this to be messy, especially the end. We'd already had like the big conclusion and stuff, which I wasn't happy about, because at one point in the book I thought there were going to be elements that I really enjoyed, and then it went back to a different direction. But we'd had the big epic conclusion and I was like, yep, cool, fine, whatever. Can we go back to what I love about this series? And I thought that was gonna happen. Then instead of what I assumed is that we were going to take this knowledge we'd learned in this book and bring it back to the situation relevant to the first book, we had an epilogue which was a 1.5 pages that felt like a normal epilogue to a book. Then there was a chapter break and a new action scene started, and then we had another chapter after the epilogue, which just really confused me. There was just this really big action scene that I guess is supposed to lead it into the next book, but it just felt really, really messy. It felt messy and rushed, and I'm confused as to why it happened, and I feel like there needed to be something in between the big conclusion and this action scene to make me understand why this action scene was taking place here and why it had to be at the end of this book instead of like near the beginning of the next one, which I guess I will find out. I'm assuming because of this that the next book is going to deal with something a little bit different, so that scene would have been out of place. But yeah, overall I just felt like it was something I'd read before. It was messy, it was rushed, and I'm so sad about this. I think this is my lowest rated Brandon Sanderson book as well, because what I typically expect from Sanderson is something really well plotted with reveals that just blow my mind, because they've been laid out there when you think about it. Like when the reveal happens and you think you can pinpoint every moment throughout the book that this has been hinted at, and you just didn't get it. But what happened in this is that I just didn't get the reveals. One of them felt like a little bit of a stretch. Nothing really blew my mind, and the plot just felt a little bit all over the place, and I'm sad. I'm really sad about it. I will continue with the series. Hopefully it's like a second book slump as opposed to an indication that I'm not going to enjoy the rest of the series, but I just hope that book 3 brings it back to what I really enjoyed about the first book. I then finally read Emperor of Evening Stars by Laura Thalassa. This is the 2.5 installment in the Bargainer series, which is a fairy romance story that follows a young woman called Callie, who is a siren, and she has a bracelet of hundreds of black beads that like wind up her arm, and each bead represents a debt that she owes to the Bargainer. Now the Bargainer is this dominant fantasy presence in the mortal world, and he is known for making bargains with people and being absolutely ruthless, and one thing you can always count on is that the Bargainer will collect. However, it has been 7 years since Callie has last made a deal with the Bargainer, and as of yet he has not come to collect until one day he finally does. So the 2.5 installment is entirely from the Bargainer's perspective. The Bargainer is also known as Desmond Flynn, and it is told throughout the time period of his life. So it starts 270 years in the past. The first like half of this is set in that past timeline, and we are going through some of the things that Desmond has done and some pivotal moments in his life, and then around halfway we get to the point where Desmond's life intersects with Callie's, and we start to get some elements of the first book Rhapsodic told from Desmond's perspective. I gave this one 4 stars. Honestly, it would have been 5 stars if it was more skewed towards the present timeline as opposed to the one that was really far in the past, because I was interested and I did enjoy learning more about Desmond. But my favorite thing about the first book is that it's told in 2 timelines, and we have the timeline that's 7 years in the past where Callie is amassing these debts, and then we also have present day where the Bargainer has come to collect. And my favorite part of Rhapsodic is that timeline 7 years in the past. So I adored learning that from Desmond's perspective, and the majority of this book is that 7-year timeline. When we catch up with present day, it kind of just very briefly covers the first book and the second book, but learning about that 7-year timeline, like I loved it in the first book, I loved it from Desmond's perspective. Honestly, just Desmond Flynn is one of the sexiest characters I have ever read about, and if you like fantasy romance, if you're a fan of Sarah J Maas, would definitely recommend this series. And I am so hyped, so hyped to pick up the final book in this series now, although I will be sad when it's over, I do have to say that. But I may just content myself with rereading that 7-year past perspective in Rhapsodic when I'm done. And then the final book we have to talk about today is also a short one that I also gave 4 stars, and that is Dawn Shard by Brandon Sanderson. So there's very little I can tell you about this. It is a novella in the Stormlight Archive. It's the 3.5 installment, and for those of you who don't know what the Stormlight Archive is, it is very complicated, and the plot of the series is nothing really to do with the plot of the first book. But essentially it's an adult epic high fantasy series that is about this group of legendary knights that have to reform and rise up to help fight off an oncoming apocalypse. So this novella follows 2 of the characters from the series, and they are Lopin and Ryzen. Both of them I'm at least a little bit familiar with from the core books in the series. Lopin is a member of Bridge 4, and Ryzen has mainly been seen in the interludes of the series, but I am a little bit familiar with like her backstory and her character. So the plot of this, without spoilers I guess, is that Lopin and Ryzen are embarking on this voyage to go to a mythical island that is surrounded by an impenetrable storm. There's an item or like monument type thing called Oath Gates present in the core series, and Navani has reason to believe there is an Oath Gate present on this island. Ryzen wants to go there for her own reasons, and so she goes with Navani's blessing to scout out this island and find out if there is indeed an Oath Gate on there. I would say that the main purpose of this novella is character development. As we saw with Edge Dancer, which introduced Lift, Dawn Shard felt like it was giving Ryzen horizon, a little bit more backstory and character, because from what happened in this one, I do feel like she is going to become more of an influential character in the rest of the books in the Stormlight series. With Lopen, we also had a lot of character development. He's a fun character in the series, so it was interesting to read from his perspective and find out a little bit more about him and really be in his mind as opposed to seeing him from the perspective of like usually Kaladin. So that was fun, and yeah, there's very little I can say about it. I really enjoyed the story. I preferred this to Edge Dancer because it had more of like a clear-cut plot, but it was just a novella, and in comparison to the behemoths that is the core installments in the Stormlight archive, it just isn't a whole lot of content, you know. And as is with the theme of this video, I generally don't really enjoy short stuff, so I gave it 4 stars. It had valuable information, followed characters that I enjoy, interested to learn more about them, but in reality I will only truly appreciate this when I read further into the series and see why all of this information that I found out in Dawnshard was actually relevant. So that is it. Those are the 11 books that I read in the month of February. I don't know if I'm regretting my choice to stop doing mid-month wrap-ups, because I have no idea how long I've been filming, and I read quite a few books in February. Do let me know in the comments whether you prefer me to do full month wrap-ups or break it down into mid-month. I stopped doing mid-month because it's kind of repetitive to have a wrap-up every 2 weeks as well as vlogs, and I actually don't really mind spending this time to do a full wrap-up. It's just the videos are going to be considerably longer, so please let me know which one you prefer. Do you prefer like the 2 20-minute videos, even though they can be repetitive if you watch my vlogs, or just one big monthly wrap up? Also, please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and whether you enjoyed them. But aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those. You will also find a link to my Kindle website, the Instagram for that, and 10% off discount code. That's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.